Ancient Athenaeum presents
A deep investigative study. The Door in the Wall. In 1906, at the height of his public success, Herbert George Wells wrote a short story that he barely introduced to the world. There was no manifesto, no explanatory preface, no attempt to frame its meaning. The story was called The Door in the Wall. It appeared quietly in the Daily Chronicle, one of the many newspapers Wells wrote for during a period when he was already recognised as one of Britain's most influential writers. At the time, Wells was known primarily as the man who had imagined time travel, alien invasion, and invisible men, works that fused science with social warning and had secured his place as a prophet of modernity. But this story was different. It contained no machines, no laboratories, no speculative explanations. Instead, it offered a single image: a green door in a white wall, glimpsed by a child on a London street. To understand why Wells wrote this story, and why it continues to unsettle readers more than a century later, it is necessary to understand where Wells stood in his own life at the moment of its creation. By 1906, Wells had achieved what his early life had taught him to desire. Born into a struggling lower-middle-class family in Bromley, Kent, he had known economic insecurity from childhood. His father's failed shop and declining health had forced Wells into apprenticeships he despised. Yet through education, sheer intellectual force, and relentless work, he escaped. He became a trained scientist under T.H. Huxley. He became a published author. He became financially independent. He became publicly important. And yet, in private, Wells was uneasy. In his later autobiography, Experiment in Autobiography, Wells would describe a growing sense that adulthood, particularly modern professional adulthood, demanded a narrowing of perception. Success required postponement. Rationality required suppression. Ambition required sacrifice. One could always return later, Wells told himself. Later, when time allowed. The Door in the Wall is the story of what happens when later never arrives. The protagonist, Lionel Wallace, recounts to a skeptical friend a memory from early childhood. Walking alone one day, he notices a green door set into a plain white wall. When he opens it, he enters a garden unlike anything in the ordinary world, a place of quiet harmony, affection, and peace. The inhabitants are kind, the atmosphere is complete, nothing needs explaining. Then the moment ends. When Wallace attempts to find the door again, it has vanished. As the years pass, the door reappears at critical moments in Wallace's life. Each time, it presents him with a choice. Each time, the timing is inconvenient. He is on his way to school, to an examination, to a professional engagement, to a political obligation. Each time, Wallace tells himself he will return later. Wells structures the story carefully so that Wallace's worldly success mirrors his spiritual loss. He becomes a capable student, a disciplined man, a rising political figure. He is admired, trusted, promoted. Yet his inner life grows increasingly hollow. The memory of the garden becomes not a comfort, but a wound. What makes the story extraordinary is Wells's refusal to decide whether the garden is real. The narrator does not know. The reader cannot know. Wells himself never explains. This ambiguity was deliberate. By 1906, Wells had begun to move away from the confident, explanatory tone of his early science fiction. he had become increasingly skeptical of the idea that all human experience could be reduced to rational systems. In The Door in the Wall, he allows mystery to remain unresolved, not as a failure of knowledge, but as a truth in itself. Scholars have identified at least 3 possible readings of the story, all of which Wells sustains simultaneously. The garden may be a genuine supernatural realm, accessible only to children or the unconditioned mind. It may be a psychological refuge, a dissociative fantasy formed in response to emotional neglect. Or it may be neither of these, but something more abstract, a symbol of authentic being, permanently inaccessible once one fully commits to the machinery of adult life. Wells offers no hierarchy among these interpretations. Instead, he frames the story as testimony. Wallace believes. The narrator doubts. The reader must live with the tension between them. This narrative structure was influenced by Wells's growing admiration for Henry James, whose work explored consciousness and perception rather than external action. The calm, almost clinical tone of the story intensifies its emotional impact. There are no dramatic confrontations, no moral lectures. The tragedy unfolds quietly through missed opportunities and polite refusals. The ending is devastating in its restraint. Wallace is found dead at the bottom of a construction site, one of the raw, unfinished spaces of modern progress. A ladder lies nearby. There are no witnesses. It is unclear whether he slipped, fell, or was pursuing the door one final time. Once again, Wells refuses to resolve the ambiguity. If Wallace was delusional, then the modern world has crushed a sensitive man. If the garden was real, then he reached it only by surrendering his life. If the distinction is meaningless, then the story becomes a final indictment of a society that teaches people to distrust what makes life whole. For Wells, this was not abstract speculation. At the time of writing, he was increasingly aware of the compromises he himself had made. His role as a public intellectual demanded clarity, authority, and confidence. Yet The Door in the Wall records a quieter truth, that something essential may be incompatible with worldly success. Unlike The Time Machine or The War of the Worlds, this story does not warn humanity about the future. It mourns what is lost in the present. Wells would go on to write histories, utopias, and global forecasts. He would attempt to map the destiny of civilization itself. But this small story remains one of his most personal works, a confession disguised as fiction. It endures because it names a fear that modern life continues to produce, that somewhere early on we encountered something true and complete, and turned away, intending to return when it was more convenient, and that the door did not wait.